Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here, and I'm really honored to follow Ada Colau. I am a great admirer of the project. I want to talk a bit about what is a city. I think up till quite recently you could say that if it was very densely built, it was a city. Let me posit that today a lot of density is actually de-urbanizing the city. Think of mega projects that take over urban tissue, little streets, little squares, little old buildings, places that long-term residents felt this was their place. When that happens, when that inserts itself into a city, no matter how it adds to the density, I would argue it de-urbanizes. And so what I want to talk about, and I have clearly very little time, but there's a very long text for those of you who are interested. I want to talk about investments that are, investments that are happening in property. So let me just move straight into it. I'm working with the data sets of the top 100 cities that are the object of desire, if you want, of investors. A lot of this investment, what I'm talking about, minimum price, to give you a sense, an idea, is $5 million in the case of New York. It's going, the value is going to change in other places. Mostly what I'm focusing on here is either corporate buildings or very luxury apartments. Now, for me, a city, just as background, is a complex but incomplete system. And in that mixity of complexity and incompleteness lies the capacity of cities to have very long lives, much longer lives than very powerful corporations, which often are very closed systems. So if you think of a city like London, I don't know about Venice, I would not dare to talk about Venice being here in Venice, but if you think of New York City, if you think of London, those are cities where most of the very powerful corporations that once existed, I emphasize most, not all, no longer exist. But the city of London, I mean the larger city, exists, and so do the neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods are places, are modest places. They have outlived very powerful actors. So it tells you something about the city. It cannot be reduced to simply a set of corporate sectors. Now, here are some figures on investments. This is just acquiring property. This is not about developing. And the full list is 100. And I also just got the data for the last year. This is just 1 year, 2013 to 2014. And you can see that New York metro region is at the top, 55 billion. This is just buying. This is just 1 year. This is a process that really takes off after 2008, the crisis, but really becomes very, very strong in the last few years. London Metro number 2, et cetera, Paris number 6. Most people in Paris, by the way, are barely aware that this is happening. I'm looking forward to Mesika's talk here. Now, this is another way of distributing. So when you look at the top 100 cities, at the end it is a very sort of small share. And as you can see there, that Miami is there at the bottom of this. But this, again, I repeat, this is a list of 100. If you just, something was mixed here. Okay, a slide was lost. So this is foreign property. I wanted to emphasize that if you look at foreign investment, in other words, not national, but all kinds of foreign, then London is number 1. And what is quite interesting is if you want the invisibility of it. So I like to point out, what does this all look like? And here is one case. This is one Chinese company that owns all of these buildings. They're mostly landmarked. Nothing can be changed, at least for a while. And I think a very good taste, by the way, this company. These are very, very nice. I don't particularly like that one over there, and that is probably not a landmark building. But so the point here is, this is not just about, buying and tearing down. When you hear people walking by, the tourists, I did a long walk there with somebody from the site who was writing a story about all of this, and you heard the tourists literally say, look at these wonderful British buildings. Of course, they're British buildings, you know, British history, but they're all owned by one Chinese company. So there is a second issue here that I want to point out, which is that in all its materiality, this is a kind of invisible project. You know, you don't know that it is foreign owned. Now, I don't think that the fact that it is foreign owned matters that much. My main concern is this big capacity that corporations have to buy a whole set of buildings. I don't know exactly where that goes, but that privatizes. That sort of destroys some of this notion of the incompleteness of cities. Now, this is another case. This is actually, this is site development. This is also a foreign company that has bought a very big piece of land in New York, and that, I would say, is not good taste. They are building 14 of these huge towers. That, again, raises the density, but actually de-urbanizes that space. Now, if you look at all of these figures, when it comes to these top 100 cities, they represent 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, and 76% of property investment. Now, if we wanted to enter the, let's say, the gossip columns, this data actually exists. I didn't gather this. And you can see these are the global multimillionaire, etc. And here are all the cities. It includes Cape Town, Palm Beach, Sydney, etc. You know, this is not of particular interest to me, but what is interesting is the amount of buying that is happening. And that, to me, coming back to this definition of the city as complex but incomplete, I find a little disturbing. The total value, the worldwide real estate assets, now when you talk that language, real estate assets, it means that there is a bit of financializing that has happened, right? It can circulate globally as a value, is $217 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. I know that this language translates very, very differently in different languages, but you can see it's quite a bit. Now, just to put this in perspective, if you look at the value of finance, just as a juxtaposition, where the typical measure is outstanding derivatives, that is in the quadrillions. So finance is way ahead. But if you look at something like global GDP of all the countries in the world, then you are back to the trillions, you know, like 800 trillion. But so this is quite a bit. I give you these other figures so that you understand what it is. Now, so this is another way of looking at what this all look like. And this is London property purchased by overseas companies from 2005 to 2014. And you can see it's a lot. London is a key destination. You know, I think its history of empire is also contributing to this. You know, history sort of catches up. And here we go to Manhattan. And one thing that is very important in Manhattan in this whole bit of buying are shell companies. So I just want to run you very quickly through some figures that have to do with that. So here you have that in 2014, 54% of sales over 5 million in Manhattan were to shell companies. Shell companies are fictitious companies. You know, they really, this is sort of something that is an instrument to buy in this case. And here we have, so now come 2 or 3 very famous, fancy, much admired, blah, blah buildings. Not admired by everybody, by the way, but still admired. Time Warner Center, 122 of the 192 condos are owned by people who use shell companies that hid their identities. So you get a picture. Here is another famous building in Manhattan, Bloomberg Tower. 57% of condos are owned by shell companies. And that is why so many of these buildings at night are dark. You don't see life in there, really. And this is the Plaza. 69% of condos are owned by shell, and so it goes on and on. Now, that's not all that is happening in this domain that is concerning me, that worries me a bit. One is the inventing of new housing markets, which is really a kind of matching market, which is used, you know, by universities if they want to hire specialized people. They go to only some other universities to recruit. So, but this is a very interesting application of that concept. So here you have one of these matching markets, and the list goes on. I just have a few here. And the key feature is minimum prices. So in the case of Monaco, and the main nationalities, what you see here are the main nationalities and the prices. In the case of Monaco, 18.9 million, et cetera, et cetera. This is the Financial Times prepared this a few years ago. And so there you see, and then it goes on and on. Very interesting to me is that in Shanghai, if you see, the world is buying. Hong Kong, it's mostly mainland Chinese who are buying. These are the main nationalities, not the only ones. Anyhow, and Dubai has a very international structure that is quite different, you know, from others. Now, a Guardian photographer got access to some of these properties, and I'm just showing you two images. Some of these properties, this is London, have not been inhabited for years. Here's another one. This takes quite a bit of time for that much moss to grow. Now, juxtaposing, and again, this is a case of the United States. We have millions of households that have been thrown out of their homes, which also generates more empty urban space. This is a list of foreclosures. The data come from the central bank. When Bernanke, the head of the Fed in New York, when he stepped down, he made a big speech about all the good things, and then he said two things that were intractables. One concerned finance, dark pools in finance. I won't talk about that. The other one concerned this. He said, and by the end of 2014, and here it's always 2014, the 14 that comes up, so don't get too confused. So by the end of 2014, he said, 14 million households will have lost their homes. So this is a very serious kind of situation. It's happening in Europe too. Germany, over 1 million, the list goes on after 2009, over 1 million households. A household can be 1, 2, 3 people. In the case of the United States, we're talking about millions, 30 millions minimum. And again, in its materiality, this is an invisible story. So why does this all matter? And here I want to come back to this notion of the city. So I started out saying the city is a complex but incomplete system. If you have massive projects, massive densities, you are losing urbanity, you are losing cityness. You're adding density, which, you know, for some is enough to have a city. But there is more. In a way, the large cities especially are one of the few places where those without power get to make a history, they get to make a culture, they get to make an economy. They are also today's frontier zone, I think. I think of a frontier zone as a zone where actors from very different worlds can have an encounter. If you think of low-wage workers or low-income families, it's in cities where they actually can have an encounter with power, with wealth, et cetera, et cetera. And out of that comes learning. Out of that can come a positionality. And I think that we need to protect the cityness of cities. And I think, as I said already, more and more built stuff is not necessarily city. It's not necessarily urban. And one property, one capacity that cities have is that, and it's very partial, it's very momentary, that at various times of the day, the city reduces us all, or makes us all, in a more positive sense, urban subjects. Not religious, not class, not ethnic, no, urban. And these are very precious moments of the day, but they enable that. There are very few spaces that allow that. Now, if you think of large, complex, corporate setups, that does not enable that. The poor, the low-income worker can go in there and clean, but when he's done, he goes out. In the city, on the other hand, you have a lot of neighborhoods that are poor, where real lives can take place, where local economies are made, where little local cultures can thrive. So in that sense, the history that we are witnessing that is happening, I think is very disturbing to me. I want to juxtapose to that the fact of land grabs in the global South.